In the spring of 1939, Cecil Beaton arrived at Buckingham Palace with his camera, his trademark soft focus aesthetic, and a clear brief. He wasn't there to document the new Queen of England as she was. He was there to define her as she needed to be seen. The portraits he produced, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in pearl white gowns, against backgrounds that dissolved into light, with that composed, slightly tilted expression of gentle authority, weren't photographs. They were policy. They established the visual language of her public persona with such precision that it held, essentially unchanged, for the next 6 decades. Pearls, upturned hat, the radiant smile that the press would describe in those terms for the rest of her life. Beaton himself, according to Hugo Vickers' biography, and Vickers was one of the few biographers to have known her personally, described her as a marshmallow made on a welding machine, which sounds affectionate until you sit with the actual meaning of it. One of her contemporary observers was considerably more direct. Stephen Tennant, whose assessment Vickers also preserved, described her this way: "She looked everything that she wasn't. Gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote." Behind that carefully maintained impression, the same observer noted, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. Beaton built the image. She maintained it. For 60 years, the British public looked at the pearls and the hat and the smile and concluded, here is a woman of quiet grace and national dignity. A significant number of them, following exactly the same public record, eventually arrived somewhere considerably less flattering than that. This video is built on the evidence they were responding to. Her name was Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon, born August 4, 1900, the 9th of 10 children of Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, Scottish aristocracy, comfortable and ancient, but not royal. She died March 30th, 2002, aged 101. Between those 2 dates, she was made a queen, buried a king, outlived a daughter, accumulated what multiple named publications documented as between £4 and £7 million in personal debt, and sustained what is arguably the most successfully constructed public persona in modern British history. The thesis here is simple. The image was the mechanism. The mechanism served specific purposes, and those purposes had victims. Begin with the appearance, because the appearance is where the mechanism started. Contemporary descriptions of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's looks divide cleanly between those operating inside the official narrative and those who observed her with detachment. The official narrative, consolidated by Fleet Street coverage of her 1923 Westminster Abbey wedding, and then cemented by Beaton's portraiture, described a natural prettiness, a freshness, something warm and uncomplicated. Beaton's portraits were praised by critics as some of the most radiant studies of a young mother in the Royal Photographic Archive, which tells you a great deal about what Beaton was capable of with controlled light and the right dress, and rather less about bone structure. Tennant's hard-as-nails verdict is the sharper account. Behind the soft visual language, behind the warmth consistently described as effortless, was something that looked out and calculated with considerable efficiency. The beauty story matters because it's the first layer of the construction. You start by believing the image. Everything that follows depends on that acceptance. She married Prince Albert, Duke of York, second son of George V, in Westminster Abbey on April 26, 1923. She had declined his proposals twice before accepting. The first refusal came in 1921. She declined again in 1922. Her recorded explanation for the hesitation was that she was afraid, never again to be free to think, speak, and act as she felt she ought to. The reluctance was performed early and consistently. It became the foundational element of her persona, A woman who never wanted any of this, who bore the weight of royal duty with grace because she had no choice, who smiled through all of it out of love of country and fidelity to her husband's need. William Shawcross, her official biographer, writing in 2009 with full access to the royal archives, described her as possessing indomitable optimism, zest for life, good manners, a mischievous sense of humor. The authorized account is always the kindest account. What it doesn't adequately explain is how a woman who never wanted power managed to accumulate it, retain it, and deploy it with considerable precision for 8 decades, or what happened to the people who stood in the path of her keeping it. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had been twice divorced. The constitutional machinery that forced him out was driven primarily by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, the Church of England, and the Cabinet. Multiple biographical sources confirm that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and her husband were, by most accounts, genuinely caught off guard when the crown came to them. The story of her orchestrating the crisis is a step beyond what the evidence supports. What she did in the years immediately following tells you far more than any alleged pre-abdication maneuvering. Within months of her accession as queen consort, she was writing to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, about Wallis Simpson and describing her, in a documented letter, as a naughty lady. That phrase, the propriety of the surface, the cold contempt underneath, became the working model of her method for the next 66 years. She set about marginalizing the Duke and Duchess of Windsor with the methodical patience of someone who understood that social ostracism, properly applied, is more durable than any formal sanction. She worked to dissuade the upper reaches of British society from attending the Duke of Windsor's wedding to Mrs. Simpson. When Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas during the Second World War, a posting widely understood as honorable exile, she sent telegrams to Nassau officials with explicit instructions. Don't bow to Mrs. Simpson, and don't address her as Your Royal Highness. A former king, stationed in the Caribbean, his wife's script of courtesy by his sister-in-law's administrative effort from across the Atlantic. She maintained a lifelong refusal to permit Edward and Wallis to return to England. Biographer Ingrid Seward, reviewing the full arc of the campaign, was unambiguous. The Queen's attitude to the Windsors bordered on a vendetta. George VI died on February 6, 1952, aged 56. He had been worn down by a role he hadn't sought and hadn't been trained for. A role he had only because his brother had chosen a woman over a throne. Elizabeth blamed Edward directly for that death. She told Prince Charles that she could never forgive his great-uncle, knowing what the burden of sovereignty had done to her husband's health and spirit. She delivered that verdict to a grandson she adored, framing 16 years of systematic exclusion as moral instruction for the next generation. When pressed on the relentlessness of the exile, her reported justification was this: "You can't have 2 kings, can you? You can't have 2 kings. You can, however, have 1 queen mother with a grace and favor London residence, a funded public role, the full institutional apparatus of the monarchy at your disposal, and exactly 50 years in which to use it." After George VI's death, the official story of her widowhood followed a familiar arc: devastation, withdrawal, eventual recovery, dignified public service. The grief was genuine. The withdrawal was real. She retreated to Scotland, and Winston Churchill was sufficiently concerned about her state of mind to meet with her personally. That meeting came approximately 8 months after the king's death. He persuaded her to resume public duties. She accepted. What followed wasn't the quiet semi-retirement of a woman who had never wanted the spotlight. As Queen Mother, she undertook more than 40 official visits abroad. She accumulated 350 patronages and presidencies. In November 1953, less than 2 years after her husband's death, Parliament passed a law giving her formal constitutional authority to act for the Queen whenever the Queen was abroad. That is a legal instrument, not a ceremonial courtesy. When the transition from Buckingham Palace to Clarence House was first proposed in 1953, she wrote what were described as impassioned letters to her daughter, arguing against the move. The woman who had never wanted to be queen required considerable persuasion before vacating the palace. She retained Clarence House as her London residence from 1953 until her death in 2002. 50 years. The financial record reinforces the argument from an entirely different direction. Multiple contemporaneous press sources documented her overdraft at Coutts Bank. The Guardian, writing in 2002, the year she died, cited a figure of £4 million. The Daily Mail put it at $7 million. The Chicago Tribune, reporting in 1999, listed her personal debt at $6.5 million against estimated assets of approximately $42 million, and noted that the debt could easily be wiped away with the sale of some of her jewelry or antiques. She didn't wipe it away. She was 98 years old and had other priorities. Queen Elizabeth II addressed her mother's financial habits with a joke that circulated widely. Coutts would have folded long ago, but for Mummy's overdraft. Government memos from the 1960s, later published by The Independent via the National Archives, told a less charming version of the same story. Her household had been in sustained rows with the Treasury over the payment of expenses for royal haircuts and clothing. Her household treasurer was regarded, in the diplomatic language of royal staff, as holding the most difficult job in her employ. She was a serious gambler on horse racing, with a direct telephone line to her bookmakers. The 1980s satirical program Spitting Image ran a recurring caricature of her with a thick Birmingham accent and a permanent copy of the Racing Post, which wasn't, by the standards of the period, particularly unjust. The satire was affectionate precisely because the underlying observation was accurate. The spending wasn't carelessness or oversight. It was the behavior of someone who had decided, permanently and without apparent reconsideration, that ordinary financial accountability didn't apply to people of her position. She had debts she never paid, funded by a daughter who publicly joked about them. The reluctant queen, who never wanted any of this, demonstrated with her balance sheet how thoroughly she had decided to enjoy it. Princess Margaret Rose was born on August 21, 1930. She died on February 9, 2002, 8 weeks before her mother. She was 71 years old. In the years between, she fell in love with a man the institution wouldn't permit her to marry, waited 2 years in enforced separation while he lived alone in a Brussels hotel room, eventually gave him up, accepted a proposal from another man the day after learning the first man was planning to marry someone else, married that second man, watched the marriage collapse, and spent the back half of her life smoking heavily, drinking heavily, and being described, in published biographical literature, as a chain-smoking, chain-drinking, man-eating monster with flashes of wit. That description is Craig Brown's, from his 2017 biography, Ma'am Darling. It's both precise and, in context, rather devastating. The trajectory had a specific origin. It began with Group Captain Peter Townsend. Townsend was a Battle of Britain pilot, decorated for his wartime service, who served as equerry first to George VI and then, after the King's death in 1952, as comptroller of the Queen Mother's own household. He had been divorced, his first wife found guilty of adultery in the proceedings, and he and Margaret fell in love in the period following her father's death. He proposed in April 1953. Margaret was 22 years old. The constitutional barriers were immediate and substantial. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, those under 25 required the sovereign's consent to marry. The Church of England, which formally opposed remarriage after divorce, objected on doctrinal grounds. Winston Churchill's cabinet was opposed. Queen Elizabeth II refused consent, and rather than take a public position that might force the question, arranged for Townsend to be posted as heir attaché to Brussels, where he lived alone in a hotel room for the next 2 years. Margaret remained in England. They were permitted to correspond. Hugo Vickers, who knew the Queen Mother personally and whose 2005 independent biography is the most authoritative account available, confirmed that she was opposed to Princess Margaret's romance with Peter Townsend and that she despised her daughter's suitor. The biography, Margaret, the Last Real Princess, describes her as instrumental in steering Margaret away from marriage. Her opposition was real, her influence was real, and she deployed both. The Honest account also notes that she was deploying them alongside the Church of England, the Cabinet, the Queen, and a constitutional act from 1772. So the accurate account distributes responsibility across multiple institutions, rather than concentrating it entirely in one place. Documents held in the National Archives, available since 2004, reveal a more complicated picture than the popular version of events. By 1955, with Anthony Eden now Prime Minister, a man who had been divorced and remarried himself, a specific plan had been worked out. Under its terms, Margaret could marry Townsend, renounce her rights of succession, keep her royal title and her civil list allowance of £6,000 per year, plus an additional £9,000 on marriage, and continue her public duties in England. Eden wrote to Commonwealth Prime Ministers, "Her Majesty wouldn't wish to stand in the way of her sister's happiness." 3 separate drafts of a formal statement Margaret could have delivered were drawn up and preserved in the government files. The path existed. The succession cost was real, but the door was open. Margaret wrote to Eden in August 1955, telling him she would see Townsend in October, and that only by seeing him in person could she decide properly whether she could marry him. They met. On October 31st, 1955, she issued a public statement. "I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend," it read. The language in the final version emphasized duty and church teaching. An earlier draft, removed by officials before finalization, had included a more personal formulation. "I have come to the conclusion that it is necessary for my future happiness that I should marry P.T." They took the personal version out. They left the institutional one. Townsend himself, writing in his 1978 memoir, Time and Chance, offered the most honest account of what had happened. "She could have married me, only if she had been prepared to give up everything. Her position, her prestige, her privy purse. I simply hadn't the weight, I knew it, to counterbalance all she would have lost." He wasn't blaming anyone in that passage. He was describing the calculation Margaret had been required to make in conditions that had been shaped by the institution, the church, the cabinet, and her mother's personal opposition, to be as unfavorable as possible. What Armstrong Jones proposed to her reportedly the day after she learned that Townsend was planning to marry a young Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Germania, who was half his age and who reportedly bore a noticeable physical resemblance to Margaret, says something about the state of mind in which the consolation marriage was entered. The engagement was announced in February 1960. They married in May. The marriage later failed. Andrew Morton, who built his career documenting what the royal family preferred to conceal, stated plainly that the family did little to help Princess Margaret overcome her battle with depression. The physical and mental health struggles that marked her later years were, by most biographical accounts, substantially rooted in the unhappiness that began in 1955. Where the Queen Mother enters the record most precisely is in a detail Vickers recorded, and that no one has contested. On the night of Margaret's final meeting with Peter Townsend, the meeting that preceded her public statement by days, the last encounter with any genuine hope attached to it, the Queen Mother attended an evening engagement at the University of London. Margaret had dinner alone, on a tray. One evening's social arrangement does not constitute a verdict. The detail is precise. It comes from the most authoritative independent biographer available, and it does not accommodate a flattering reading. It isn't what a mother who had been fighting for her daughter's happiness looks like on the most consequential night of that daughter's adult life. Margaret died 8 weeks before her mother. The woman whose dinner she had eaten alone on a tray, in whose household Townsend had served as comptroller, and who had, by Vickers' account, despised him throughout. That woman survived her younger daughter by 49 days. The order of deaths isn't a moral argument. It's a fact, and it sits uncomfortably inside the official narrative of maternal devotion. Margaret is the best documented case of the family's failures. She isn't the most extreme one. In 1961, Burke's Peerage, the authoritative register of the British aristocracy, the official record of family lineages, listed 2 women as deceased, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, daughters of the Queen Mother's brother John. Both had severe learning difficulties. Both were alive. Both had been institutionalized. The record had been falsified. Catherine Bowes-Lyon survived until at least 1987. In that year, The Sun broke the story that 2 of the Queen Mother's nieces were living in a long-stay hospital facility, wearing donated clothing with no personal possessions, while their family had allowed their existence to be falsified in the peerage record for 26 years. Institutional records subsequently described the pattern as deliberate erasure and active deception. The Queen Mother was reportedly aware of her niece's hospital admittances by 1982 at the latest. This case has named individuals, verified dates, a named publication that broke the story, and documented institutional records. It also has a near-total absence from the official narrative of the Queen Mother's public life, despite being the clearest documented instance of the family's willingness to simply erase members who were inconvenient. Nerissa and Catherine were Bowes-Lyon relatives who complicated the family's preferred self-presentation. The preferred self-presentation held. The 2 women wore donated clothing in a long-stay facility for decades, while their names appeared as dead in the register of British aristocracy. Diana Frances Spencer married Prince Charles at St. Paul's Cathedral in July 1981. She was 20 years old. The Queen Mother was 80 and reportedly pleased with the match. Diana was young, aristocratic, photogenic, and appeared, from a palace perspective, manageable. That institutional assessment proved, as the decade progressed, to be considerably mistaken. Tina Brown's Palace Papers, published in 2022 and drawing on extensive palace sources, documented the Queen Mother's view of Diana in considerable detail. As Diana's unhappiness became undeniable, the emotional candor in interviews, the visible distress, the difficulty conforming to the protocol of a family that expressed nothing, the Queen Mother viewed these things with increasing displeasure. The displeasure wasn't directed at the circumstances producing the unhappiness. It was directed at the displaying of it. Charles's affair with Camilla Parker Bowles had its origins in approximately 1970. It paused when Charles married Diana in 1981. It resumed, according to Jonathan Dimbleby, Charles's authorized biographer, in approximately 1986. 5 years into the Wales marriage. The Queen Mother's response to this, per Tina Brown, was to regard the Camilla relationship as a practical reality to be accommodated, not a scandal to be suppressed. Brown is direct about where the sympathies settled. The Queen Mother regarded Diana as the primary agent of damage, not Charles, who'd conducted a decadal-long affair. The specific allegation, that the Queen Mother actively provided rooms at Birkhall, her Scottish Highland retreat, or at Clarence House for Charles and Camilla to use during the affair, is reported by palace sources cited in Tina Brown's work without documentary confirmation and should be treated as reported rather than established. Birk Hall is confirmed as the Queen Mother's Scottish home. After her death in 2002, Charles moved into both Clarence House and Birk Hall, the two properties most central to her life for half a century. The specific allegation about those properties being made available during her lifetime remains a matter of palace source reporting. What is established from Tina Brown's sourcing is the attitude. She accommodated the affair as a practical reality. She held Diana responsible for the damage the affair was causing. Two things were happening simultaneously in the Wales marriage in the late 1980s. A husband was conducting a prolonged affair, and a wife was publicly exhibiting the unhappiness this produced. The Queen Mother found the second thing considerably more objectionable than the first. Diana, who wasn't known for underestimating what was being done to her, reportedly suspected Clarence House specifically. She inserted the Queen Mother's name into her manuscript, according to Andrew Morton, naming her explicitly in the account of what was happening to the marriage. Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, married Princess Elizabeth in 1947 as Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, having renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles and his Greek Orthodox faith. When his wife acceded to the throne in 1952, the question of what name the royal house would carry became immediately political. Philip proposed it be called the House of Mountbatten. The palace establishment, with Queen Mary and the Queen Mother among those documented as opposing the Mountbatten name, ensured that the children remained Windsors. The name Philip had hoped to contribute to the dynasty was set aside. He reportedly said to a friend, "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." The Queen Mother's role in that decision wasn't principal, but she was part of the consensus that settled it against him. Philip had surrendered his naval career, his titles, his faith, and ultimately his surname for an institution that then spent the next several years debating whether his family name was acceptable for the heir to the throne. The foreign-born elements of the royal family, Philip, Wallis, Diana, were consistently treated, by the palace consensus the Queen Mother helped shape, as problems to be managed rather than people to be included. The Queen Mother died on March 30, 2002, with her surviving daughter at her bedside at Royal Lodge, Windsor. More than 200,000 people filed past her coffin as it lay in state at Westminster Hall. On the day of her funeral, more than 1 million people lined the route from central London. The numbers were real. The grief was real for many of them. The people who turned out were mourning someone they had genuinely liked. The composed elderly woman with the upturned hat. The one who kept smiling. The one who had looked after the nation's morale during the Blitz and stood on bomb sites in the East End and stayed when she was advised to leave. The public record she had managed so carefully for so long had done its job. Prince Andrew was born in February 1960, the second son of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. By multiple accounts, he was among the Queen Mother's favorites in the next generation of the family. A book documenting his later life contains a quote recorded around the time of his early childhood, the precise speaker unspecified, but the sentiment apparently widely shared. "All in all, he's going to be terribly spoiled by all of us, I'm sure." Queen Elizabeth II herself observed, with what turned out to be unusual accuracy, that Andrew would probably never have to do his own household accounts. He didn't. The Epstein connection became public knowledge in 2019, 17 years after the Queen Mother's death. His military titles were stripped in 2022. He remains, at the time of writing, among the least popular figures in British public life, which is, in a specific sense, the most honest monument available to the values the Queen Mother actually transmitted. The argument isn't that she made Andrew who he is. The argument is that the family she shaped, the priorities she modeled, and the entitlement she embodied and never examined, produced a culture in which someone like Andrew could spend decades assuming he was exempt from considerations that applied to other people. She had spent 101 years making exactly that assumption about herself, to considerably more favorable press. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was genuinely courageous in the specific circumstances that suited her temperament. Wartime, widowhood, the long performance of national composure that she sustained with formidable consistency into her second century. The courage was real. The composure was real. The charm was real enough to produce one of the most durable public personas in modern royal history. The official biography uses words like indomitable optimism and mischievous sense of humor. The independent biographer who knew her best used the word despised to describe her feelings about her daughter's would-be husband. The most thorough account of her attitude toward Diana uses the phrase increasing displeasure for Diana's visible suffering and practical reality to be accommodated for the affair that was producing it. Government memos document the Treasury rows over her haircuts. The Sun documented her nieces in donated clothing in a long-stay facility. The Guardian documented the overdraft at Coutts. The biographer Ingrid Seward used the word vendetta. All of these things are true simultaneously. The image she maintained didn't require the suppression of the other things. It required the permanent prioritization of appearances over the people behind them, the careful management of what was visible, and a studied indifference toward what wasn't. Tennant's observation that behind the veil of gentle composure she was hard as nails was published as admiring. The hardness on his reading was a virtue. Whether it was a virtue depends on where you were standing. Peter Townsend was standing in a Brussels hotel room. Margaret was having dinner on a tray. Diana was being identified as the primary agent of damage in a marriage her husband was conducting alongside a decade-long affair. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were living in a long-stay hospital facility under names the family had listed as deceased in the peerage record. The smile never wavered. Beaton had made it structural by 1939, and it held for 60 more years. That's the record. Subscribe for more stories like this.